So, welcome to the second lecture of the Garrod seminar series on rethinking past globalization here at the McDonald Institute for Archaeological Research in Cambridge. For those of who are new, the Garrod seminars are the main seminar series of the archaeology department, and they provide an opportunity to engage with interesting and diverse scholars. Barry is one of them. In terms of housekeeping, please be aware that the microphones on the ceiling are very sensitive, so if you have private conversations, they will be picked up on the webinar. For those of you who were here last week, I'm not going to repeat the whole introduction to the rethinking past globalization theories, but I will remind you that this series aspires to interrogate and problematize the application of globalization to the study of the past. We want to discuss the prospects for criteria-based identification of past globalizations or globalizing tendencies, with the ultimate goals of making the present relevant in archaeological research and contributing archaeological perspectives to the much debated question of globalization's beginnings. So last week, we kicked off this series with Justin Jennings, who was a pioneer in explicitly applying globalization thinking, globalization theory to archaeology. And this week, we'll hear from Barry Gills, who was a pioneer in globalization theory itself, its development from, or I don't know, cross-pollination with global systems theory, world systems theory, and the question of the antiquity of the world system and globalization. Barry Gills is professor of global development studies at the University of Helsinki, Finland. He's the founding editor and editor-in-chief of the journal Globalizations, and of the Rethinking Globalization book series with Routledge. He's also co-founder of the World Historical Systems Theory Group of the International Studies Association, and a recipient of the James N. Rosenau Award for contributions to globalization research. Among numerous publications, Barry co-edited the book The World System, 500 Years or 5,000, together with Andre Gunder Frank. So Barry will now bring us up to date on the range of conceptualizations of globalization, historical globalities, and what might constitute globalizations in world history. Over to you.
Hi, thanks very much. I just want to start, of course, by thanking Tom and Daniel and the Institute for asking me to be part of this. I had to think about it long and hard to say yes, because as you'll see in a moment, I'm not an archaeologist, and my work has diverged from work I did decades ago in this area. So with that apology, I just want to say they've been very warm and gracious and brought me to this lovely place. So I thank you all for coming to hear what I have to say about this. So I thought about, how can I make a useful, meaningful intervention from my own experience, which say about 40, 45 years since I started looking at these questions. So I'll have 10 points. Just begin, go through them. I mean, first thing I want to do is establish where I stand as a scholar, especially now. So I'm an international political economist and a critical global development studies scholar. I cannot claim to be a proper historian. But I've had a lifelong interest in world history, drew me into the arena. I mean, my recent work is expert on, for example, extractivism, global extractivism and alternatives, with the initiative by the same name that's based at my university in Helsinki in global development studies, and some international scholars. Economics and climate emergency, where we organized a group of heterodox economists to actually critique mainstream economics for its entanglement with the causes of the climate crisis and the prevention of their solutions. With the economist Jamie Morgan, who's an editor of the Real World Economics Review. I did that project with recently. And another one on post-COVID transformations and the future. So what has the pandemic done to render global changes? A whole variety of case studies and some overview. And then worked to produce, co-edit the Routledge Handbook of Transformative Global Studies, which looks very much at a range of radical alternatives, transformative praxes, pluriversal universality, deep growth, alternatives to capital, a whole array of things that are there in that sort of work. So you can see that, and so you might ask the question, so what am I doing here? Why have I been asked to intervene in this particular discussion? Well, as I say, I'm here in the spirit of an interdisciplinary dialogue. Openness to, I'll be as much a student as you are to most of this discussion, because I haven't, for me, that's what enticed me. It's a really interesting, provocative sort of project. The way that the invitation was worded, I really would have been churlish to refuse. So it was beautifully worded to get me to say, all right, I'm not good. But I think we have a commitment to transdisciplinary knowledge creation, transdisciplinary learning, transdisciplinary dialogue, and the kind of syntheses and creativity that can come out of that conceptually, analytically, theoretically. So I think that's what I'm doing here. I'm hoping that I say something useful. You'll let me know if I do. So I'm going to use my own experience. I ask you to permit that, or maybe sort of indulge me. Going back 45 years. And my engagement with some of the key concepts that are highly relevant to this whole project, this whole initiative, and to the relationship between those concepts. So that includes, obviously, globalization, world systems, civilization, global history, historical globalities. I'll go through the motions of what I mean by some of those things. So it was like just to reflect on my life and interest that led here. It was around 1978 or 79. I'm very near to retirement. Very near. I became sort of animated by this enormous interest to explore origins. And so I went into the literature existing at that time on the origins of the state, much of which was archaeological and anthropological literature, and theorization was more in vogue than in those fields, especially anthropology. And their alliance, the two. I read widely origins of class society, the origins of urbanism, the origins of systems of domination that led to imperial dominations, and the origins of capital. And capital understood as a very specific form of social relations. And I won't go into my definition of capital here. But if it arises, I'll try to explain a little more further. Actually, the Sumerologist Guillermo Gills has assured me that he has archaeological evidence of the origins of capital in the Sumerian context in the 4th millennium BCE. Right? That'll become material to my argument a little bit later. We'll see what I mean. But I really was dedicated to trying to search for the principles of those foundational forms. But why? Because I had this sense that by trying to understand those origins, these sort of original foundational origins of these forms, then I could begin to see their trajectories and how they had operated or functioned and shaped the course of global history. And the reason I wanted to do that, actually, was because I had a sense, again, that their trajectories had created what we now call our world civilization, such as it is. And but there was a mood in the air, and I shared it deeply, that this world civilization, talking about 1978 now, was on a trajectory to a kind of breakdown crisis, all right, to systemic failures of some potentially even catastrophic types. So there was that was I wasn't the only person even at that time who had that feeling about what was likely to happen. So that animated me. But then eventually, after some years of reading, it was really wide reading. I came upon all right. Let's where can we go with that understanding? So that's like to write a revisionist global history, and a revisionist global history that, on the one hand, is post-Eurocentric, because so much of world history writing in those days, 40 years ago, was still highly Eurocentric. In fact, And that is, and any other centric, whether it's Indo-centric or Sino-centric or Afrocentric, you know, to get beyond that, or the compartmentalization, the world history of Bob Moore once told me, he's a world historian, that and McNeill criticized Moore in his work. You know, just putting together the old days, 40 years ago, a world history was here's a chapter on the history of China, and here's a chapter on the history of India, and here's a chapter, and that was world history. Out of that, this is really impoverished and in a way misconceived. It's not formulated in the right way that we want to see. So why? So we wanted to create this humanocentric world history, a humanocentric global history that would function to cultivate a new form of global consciousness, which is to say an understanding shared by the majority of humanity that we have a shared history, that rather than compartmentalized and we didn't know each other, we were always others, we were always strangers. You look at what William H. McNeill called in The Rise of the West, really great work in the 60s, when he was at the University of Chicago, the history of mutuality. You know, so you're searching for connections, you're searching for mutuality, and what you search for, you may see by finding the evidence and making the conceptualizations. But that would be kind of a truly a break with the traditions of what was then passed as world history. And that kind of makes a leap over into global history, and the meaning of that term global. Much rides on that, and I'll discuss that a bit further too. So that, again, what's the utility, the function, purpose of cultivating a new kind of global consciousness through a new revisionist global history? It's because we are in a moment in human history, unprecedented in time. I don't need to belabor it, but that we are facing certain kinds of dilemmas and challenges, existential in their nature. Whereas if we don't rise above the inherited structural obstacles to cooperation that we find in the state system built on endemic competition and rivalry between states, if we don't leap up in world order, then really we as a species, I'm just speaking of that we again, might really face systemic failure, right? So that's the purpose. I'm talking about the reason to do this, which has always been kept foremost in the mind. Why should we be doing this? And remind ourselves, why are we doing this? You know, aside from that, we need to survive and pursue our career, and we might have, we have a burning interest in knowledge, but there's other purposes, yeah, in the context in which we live now. So that I just wanted to share that with you. And again, that's by doing that, you kind of come to this. You break the boundaries of methodological nationalism, right? And that leads you off into a whole new arena of concepts and of research and explorations. I'm just going to quote from the very first volume 1, issue 1 of Globalization's journal, which I founded, and I've been the editor-in-chief ever since, just 20 years now, in 2004. And there's an article there, I commissioned all these articles in this first issue, as you do. There's one here, The Global Animus, in the Tracks of World Consciousness, by the late Roland Robertson, and my now colleague in Helsinki, David Inglis. So I'll just read you their abstract. And it said, in recent years, much has been made of the idea that under conditions of globalization, more and more people in different parts of the planet conceive of themselves as part of a global society or global culture. Often it's been alleged that forms of consciousness centered around a disposition to see one's own life as a single part of the world as a whole are relatively recent for us. In this paper, we argue that such tendencies, or something very much like them, in fact, were present in the ancient Mediterranean world. We examine how ways of thinking and feeling that bear in certain social groups in the Roman Empire were prevalent and have ways that have close correspondence to modern ideas as to globality. So these were prevalent among certain social groups in the Roman Empire. Those persons regarded themselves as part of a world that was rapidly shrinking through increasing levels of political, commercial, and other modes of interconnection between its geographically disparate parts. By examining these ancient attitudes, we demonstrate an important aspect of the prehistory of modern sensibilities as to the nature of a globalized world. Moreover, by attending to ancient evidence as to the global attitudes and global consciousness, one may begin to overcome the presentism implicit in many contemporary accounts of globalization. Right. So, let's say, I think Daniel said just as we were preparing, that what's quintessential to the concept of globalization? The desire to search for connections. And if you did, it's the connections that are the first sine qua non of understanding what a globalization might mean, yeah, in reality, in history. Point taken, no controversy there. And as McNeil said, you're looking for a history of mutuality, and thus once you do that, you start looking for different kinds of patterns, social ordering, processes, structures, systems. You start developing concepts around those and the relationship or entanglement between them. You sort of map a field, sort of in a way pioneering a new field of inquiry. Deal with this. This was just natural follow. So I'm just going to talk a little bit of the history of what's mentioned, the World Historical Systems Theory Group. So we started that up, myself and David Wilkinson as co-founders, where we put together a rather large group in 1988-89. And it was very broad and multidisciplinary. We had social sciences from political science, international political economy, development studies, sociology, geography, anthropology, archaeology, and urban studies. And maybe I left out. I won't go through all the kind of names of people, but some quite well-known and established scholars in many fields. Like in archaeology, it's Michael Rowlands, Mons Larsen, Christian Christensen, Philip Cole, Robert McCormick Adams, in urban studies, Janet Abu-Ghad. I could go on, but it was a very intense group. And so, like in the framing of history of ideas by Randall Collins in his magisterial The Sociology of Philosophy, a 1,000-page tome, which is really goes through the lineages of ideas of 2,000 thinkers across much of the world, absenting the Americas. It's been pointed out by Enrique Dussel. But that you form how ideas really develop and proliferate, be refined, and then intergenerationally reproduce. Well, it starts with a circle of correspondence. So you get a group of scholars who share some common interest in a common language, common pursuit. They begin a discussion. And out of that circle of correspondence, possibly a school of thought emerges, right? And that school of thought develops its ideas internally, with key thinkers in debate within, but then sharpens them in debate with contending schools of thought, or the attention space, as Randall Collins puts it, you see. So we definitely formed a circle of correspondence amongst all those different fields, meeting very frequently and regularly, and sometimes even our own dedicated international conference, to do at the initiative of various members. And what we hoped to do, at one point when we were a little more involved after several years, 5, 6 years on, we thought we had a conference at Lund, which our friend and core member Jonathan Friedman had organized with Robert Denmark in Lund. That what we were really doing was trying to develop a new kind of social science, a social science of long-term, large-scale patterns of social change. We thought, all right, that's bold and ambitious, but we think that's what we're doing, as much as that. And that incorporated world system analysis with and without a hyphen. So in other words, Wallersteinian world system analysis with a hyphen, and Frank and Gills world system analysis framework without a hyphen, which were very different from one another, although they had some things in common. So it incorporated that, but wasn't exclusive only to that. You see, it was really rather more open to what kind of perspectives the different scholars would take, and did. But and that included comparison of world systems, yes, which we were all open to doing. And Chris Chase Dunn and Thomas Hall very keen on doing exactly that, and did in multiple studies. And even up to this day, there's Chris Chase Dunn is still very active, who is recently retired. And even to compare world systems in their variety with other values, that are sort of not world systems or outside world systems and so on. And all and there, how you can you compare them? How do you relate them to each other? What's the relationship also in history? So, but did we succeed in forming a school of thought? Well, I don't know. Work in progress. We'll see. Maybe it's like, what was it? Joe and Lai was asked about, what do you think of the French Revolution? And he said, it's too early to tell. Okay. So maybe it's too early to tell. But I do think we set something in motion, which then had its various effects, which are very difficult to quantify and measure. You kind of know them again back through the circle of correspondence, which carried on and still does. So what we had, other than one unified, consensual, coherent in that sense, school of thought that you might think it would be, it probably isn't. So within the school, there was very great variety, right? So what we wound up having was actually a very interesting array of very distinctive perspectives, different frameworks, different conceptualizations, different theories, and then thus different research and different findings when it was operationalized empirically, right? And people practiced the writing of global history, through their own more long-term, large-scale social change analysis. Yeah? So we did. I mean, I was one of those ones that sort of ambitious young fellow wanted us to have a common program and all unite around one massive project to write a revisionist global history, combining all our efforts. But it didn't happen. Maybe Peter Turchin has actually done another iteration of it now, has the funding and wide support by a lot of scholars, a lot of specialists. We had dreamed about that at the time, but we never really realized it until Turchin came on. But not about that. But the Turchin was, again, sort of one of those people that was associated with us at a certain point and worked with us kind of later in our history, as it were, and went off, to do his own. And that's what everyone did. Since there was no common definition of, say, world system, certainly not, but various ones within the group, and some that didn't even really want to use that per se, but a rather different framing altogether. So we agreed to disagree. And I'm talking now about the practical things that happen when you're trying to create a new kind of knowledge, right, of this nature that's transdisciplinary and so on. So that was reasonable, and I can sort of practical. It's a lesson to be learned, you see, that this happened some decades ago. We tried to unify and converge, make it uniform in a sense. Didn't happen. And so that what was in an agreement to continue the dialogue in the same spirit, learning from each other, communicating, corresponding, citing each other, meeting, and so on, and inviting in others, right? Doing projects. So each person also kind of taking their own individual project and in hopefully parallel and hopefully complementary ways, right? So there's a practical sense of what happened. Yeah. And I don't know, maybe it will change in the future, but that's what actually came of it. So I'm just going to shift now, point 5, about that book, that work on 500 years or 5,000 with my friend, the late undergraduate Frank. Well, so a few aspects that we were putting forward, which were very controversial then and remain controversial now. I think is that, well, we were like everyone in the group. We were very engaged with the dialogue of the others and very much learning from them and being enriched by them, and hopefully vice versa. But also very critical of all the other ones because we were trying to stake out, we're trying to persuade the others that, well, you're not see the utility of our framework and be persuaded by the arguments that we make and the evidence we bring to bear, and so on, right? So they were all doing that. Yeah, with each other, but in a friendly manner. But we particularly had a sense of friendly, critical engagement and discussion over many years with the late Immanuel Wallerstein. For some, maybe some apparent reasons, because we're using the same term, world system, but we're very different sets of understandings, right? Which he also strongly disagreed with our understandings and defended his own position very robustly, to the end. So many meetings and encounters with him many times, and he was always a lovely gentleman and a consummate professional scholar. I have to say he was remarkable. I'm not taking anything away from Wallerstein. I admire him. In my youth, I admired him greatly. I could easily become a follower of the great Immanuel Wallerstein, easily. But we took a different tack, and so this was particularly concerning a few things here, like the Eurocentrism in Wallersteinian world system theory. Well, now you're saying that capital was invented by the Europeans, and it's that in a way that we can recognize as being capital, and a capitalist society, capitalist classes, the whole capitalist world system is all European invention. Comes out of the spatial context, which goes back to the Black Death and the changes in all of that. If you read Wallerstein, but then it radiates out. It's like from that epicenter it expands out and incorporates all the rest of the world, as if all the rest of the world was sort of terra nullis, is just out there, outside the system, and then it all, right? So it's entirely Eurocentric. The entire account is Eurocentric. So we pointed this out and said, well, we know that's not our approach is not Eurocentric. In fact, we're trying to overturn Eurocentric account once and for all. And note that there's already a pre-existing world system. In fact, it goes back millennia across Afro-Eurasia. And far from Europe having invented it, they intruded into it in a most violent and aggressive manner. All right. In fact, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with that way of looking at it. And that, in fact, that 5,000 years, we came up with that 5,000 years, because we thought the evidence spoke to 5,000 years of a world system that originated in the Fertile Crescent, Egypt, Levant, Syria, Mesopotamia, and Indus, right? And then their hinterlands and so on, their peripheries and hinterlands, the original Afro-Eurasian world system. But that it was, formed formative stages. Now I think 5,000 years is maybe conservative. Maybe it should be 6, 7, 8. If you go back into the formative stages, before as a way it's fully consolidated with those forms I was talking about being very much dominant, and the whole thing being elaborated with a very a nexus that seems like looks systemic. Right? So okay, he was insisting on 500 years. No, it's 500 years. It is part of the Eurocentrism. It's 500 years. Yeah. So well, no. I mean, so then the most controversial of all, particularly to both Marxists and liberal economists and economic historians, we made this bold claim that capital had not only existed for 5 millennia, as Guillermo Aldaz pointed out in the Sumerian, but that in fact it was quite important. It was not marginal. It was not some sort of irrelevant epiphenomena thing that you just sort of categorically say it's not governing the system. It's not not shaping the system. Well, we contradicted that by saying, well, on the contrary, we think it has a central role in shaping the system and its expansion, and also its internal structures and rhythms. So that we actually elevated the whole role of capital in creating the world system and in animating the rhythms of the world system over a very long period of time, from then to now. And then many people took objection to that. Well, okay, then maybe that we need to revisit that, as it were, and see. But we also posited that that one of the things that characterized a world system was what we call, when we talk about connections, what was the central connection we were most concerned about? So something we made it come up with this concept called interpenetrating accumulation, which meant that all the various core zones and their dominant classes and their subordinate classes, by their regularized systemic exchanges, which are both material, ideational, diplomatic, political, military, etc., that they are intimately, deeply reshaping each other's social structures. Like the whole thing is kind of mutuality, which reshapes each zone, right? Which wouldn't be happening if they weren't so intimately integrated into that nexus, right? So it's not mere exchange. You know? Okay, so it's much more than that. It goes much deeper than that. You know? So we also said, like, you know, world system must have a structure. You know, this is not merely a process or a condition or a state of being, but it's a recognizable structure, and that structure is like is hierarchical, and so you have centers, peripheries, and we added hinterlands. Where hinterlands are not really outside the system; they're not an external arena, as Wallerstein said. They do have relations, right? But they have also retained a relatively important level of autonomy from the centers, right? Okay, the hinterlands. And often, sometimes, like with Toynbee, you read the study of history, there's a so-called implosion, you know, where the hinterland bounds back upon the centers and actually becomes a new ruling class. This happened in ancient Mesopotamia with Kassites and various other peoples. It happened with the Central Asian nomadic peoples and Owen Latimore's work on China and so on. You know, these frontier relationships that over and over and over and over again, this kind of thing can be studied, right? So the hinterland is not something unimportant. You know? So central periphery hinterland structure is characteristic of the world system for millennia. Keeps reproducing and reproducing and reproducing. That's not without any changes or transformations, but the structure is recognizable, can be identified, measured, analyzed. And then also that it has long cycles, that there are very not necessarily Kondratiev K waves, yeah, the Kondratievs, so dear to various people, Rostow, Wallerstein. Well, these were, you know, we tried to see how, in fact, it was intertwining, where you had long periods of expansion of the world system and a deepening and intensification of the division of labor, the international trade system, commodification, commercialization, exchange, and some stability across that. You know, sort of becomes kind of like this, it reaches a high peak of this kind of organization mode, and then reverts the various internal processes that bring this about to a more entropic phase. And these cycles we thought were very long. We could look A and B, but in our case, 500-year A and B combination cycle. That's very long. And we tried to map those out to show what they might be. Again, it was tentative sketch, you know. Then we'd have recurrent hegemonies being built as an internal characteristic because of what we call the economy-polity contradiction. Is that once you're actually enmeshed in such a nexus like this, no polity, no single polity controls all of the resources upon which they're dependent to reproduce their system. And then they have an internal urge by various means, including force, to control that. But they're like gladiators posed toward one another about this, and they generate an insecurity which is systemic. And that, you know, that, so hegemonies come, they're built, they're rebuilt again, but then they also decay, disintegrate. It's like the old Chinese cycle that, you know, there will be unity, and then there will be fragmentation, then there'll be unity again, and then there'll be fragmentation. There'll be rather kind of like that kind of cyclical idea. Hegemony rivals as part of the structure of the world system, and also then finally periodic world system crises. That there are certain periods in the history of the world system, the Afro-Eurasian world system, where the entire system seems to be going into disarray, really breaking down. And all kinds of consequences and various kinds of causes, again, I can't go into right now that would generate that, but it's part of the structure. Yeah, it's rather like, you know, in financial theory that, you know, rather than seeing a major financial crisis as something anomalous, something bizarre and unusual and exceptional, no, they're actually normal, regular, and inevitable. Yes, it's the other thesis about that. You know, remember the debates in 2008 and 2009 and so on. It's the system that creates the crisis. So we were saying it's the world system. It's part of the structure that there will be periodic, serious world system crises, which come reorganization, but also continuities, and especially in the structure. So there is like a rearranging of the parts and modes. So now, but with all that said, sorry to belabor that, myself and Gunnar Frank, we never contemplated designating the world system as we discussed it with globalization, or as globalization, or as a globalization. We just didn't. When I was been trying to remember, like, did we even discuss it? And I don't think we did. It was like parallel worlds, because I was also engaged, I'll talk about in a moment, in circles that were already starting to critically examine globalization at the beginning of the 1990s. So now on globalization. Okay, well, many of you be aware, and as the kind of vernacular common sense, now it's entered into our language. Everyone has probably heard the word all over the world. And an enormous proliferation of references when you look it up on Google or whatever. It's even overtaken the word development. Some time ago, development had been on an upward trajectory of use from 1840 onwards. It peaked about 1980 and was quickly overtaken by globalization. So it was almost like a conflation in the public discourse between the two. Development was globalization. Globalization was the future of development. And it was like it was presented like a law of history, a very positive narrative about, well, this is the final completion of efficiency in our economic paradigm. And this, by globalizing the production network and all the logistics and transportation, the consumption, the finance, and unleashing all that by deregulation, by enabling the state to do these things so that finally we could realize it in a way, Adam Smith's the perfect paradigm. and that would bring prosperity and the promise of development to the entire global south and the rest of the world. This is a big promise, right? It's huge. So this was the way globalization was presented. However, some of us, and myself included, that we take globalization as an object of critique. This concept very powerful, and we have objection to many of the ways in which it's being presented teleologically, apolitically, with essentialism, and many problems. So as an object of critique, for example, you say, well, it's too paired with neoliberalism, with neoliberal economic globalization as the actual subject they're discussing, right? And how to universalize that paradigm of neoliberal economic globalization, remake the whole world around this paradigm. Again, in a way, superseding the inherited national development models and endogenous growth models and so on, your development economies. So just rejecting, going all, that's going to be history. That's like, fossilized. So it was presented. And so that it was framed like that way, it could be understood, and it was by sort of radical critics, that it really is about the expanded reproduction of capital on a world scale. It's really about allowing a much more intensified transnationalization of capital rather than national capital. Capital will just increasingly become transnational, as will economies and societies, all transnationalized, right? And in that, would facilitate, by facilitating the free movement of capital, not of labor, but the free movement of capital and the free movement of goods. You maximize global wealth, a la Smith, fundamental to this paradigm, but also, like, on the other side of it, well, there would be a tendency to increase the exploitation of labor by this global power, and also probably to increase the level of intensification of exploitation of natural resources or nature or ecology to their detriment. One could assume, and also a temptation, this power, and states that were still entangled with that power and promoting that power, enabling that power, to look for ways of re-peripheralization of the global south, and maybe to create neo-colonial forms of subordination again. So far from liberating the world towards democracy, because that was another one of the sort of axioms, that this is all going to lead to democratization. We thought, probably not. In fact, maybe the opposite, because of what I've just said, which is not so fertile ground for genuine substantive democratization. Prospects are very different paths: oligarchization, authoritarianization, and imperialism, colonialism. Okay. That's what we said. And so so then I put together a group of my PhD students, 6, 8 of them. I was professor of global politics at Newcastle upon Tyne, and we worked for 2 years and read about 200 sources to get command of the field. Yeah? And we met every week, and then we wrote this piece called "Overturning Globalization," resisting the teleological, reclaiming the political, which then got reproduced in various collections, including a book I edited then called "Globalization and Politics of Resistance." So you see, like my initial engagement with globalization was highly critical, okay, skeptical, right from the start. Well, hold on, wait. There's so many problems going on here. Globalization is a totalizing notion of the theory of everything. It's just a muddle, and it's dangerous. And people tried that grand theory of the sociological theory of everything back in the 19th century. Did we get past that? You know, we're going to try that again. So. Not going there. So then what we did was our next move was pluralization, which means that's a meaningful plural there. Globalization. It's not one definitive consensual theory and definition of globalization. We posited that no such thing exists, nor, we argue, could it ever exist. It doesn't exist. It won't exist. It's impossible. Right? And anyway, academia is supposed to be about divergence and debate, not just like, and that's ideological. You posit that, there's only one law of history. There's only one way of progress. There's only one economic paradigm, and it's this one. We call it globalization. No, I'm sorry, we're not going there. In fact, we're going to attack it. So then the pluralization is very meaningful and purposeful, we thought. So there's, in other words, multiple narratives of globalizations. Multiple readings and interpretations of possibilities of what are globalizations, real and conceptual. Multiple processes, multiple scales, multiple alternatives, multiple potentialities, multiple trajectories. So we opened up the concept to represent this contested field. It's a deeply contested concept, and it will always be so. So that's the way it is. And we cannot change that. So just begin dealing with it. So we want to create a space for this debate, organize a place for this kind of work, and especially for, we thought, highly necessary, disaggregating this totalizing notion, globalization, into all these various aspects, and then concretizing the empirical research, right? So that you actually know what you know something about something, and you're going to try to analyze it within a larger context that might be related to the concept of globalization, right? Like that. It's a bit tentative, but we thought it was better social science. Okay. So also to note, again, like this new understanding we had, is that globalization as a concept must imply internally contradictory dimensions, processes, forces, like they're simultaneous but antagonistic or contradictory at the same time in the same supposed process of this concept, in reality, right? So like, globalization processes could be both simultaneously constructive and destructive, progressive and retrogressive, homogenizing and fragmenting, differentiating. And another point we wanted to make was that resistance, antipodal oppositional forces. So, reacting back dialectically with the forces they encounter under the rubric globalization, that's actually to be understood as internal to the processes of globalization, not something external. It's intrinsic to the concept. We thought that was better social science and better reflecting realities in the world and processes that we could see that, right? And also that we do insist on, if you're going to deal with globalization, you need to combine very explicitly in your whole conceptualization, both diachronic and synchronic analysis together. And especially the synchrony, because if you're not looking across the entire whole, you see, like the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And you read any particular instance, and even micro, as like the global is instantiated in the local. I think this is something maybe Sassi wanted to talk about some time ago, and others. So, okay, right, this is becoming more complex. It's more complex, you know, and we reckon that was good. You know, it should be so complex if it's going to be good social science and good history. And then that gets us away from overly deterministic understandings. Like, you know, the law of history is inevitable. It's bound with progress. It's almost conflated with progress in all sorts of ways: economic process, social process, progress, moral progress, political. You know, human progress. Well, is it really? Is that what's happened? Is that what globalization paradigm and its dominance in the last 40 years has brought us? You think so? Really? Well, I have to be convinced. So, and then it's like, it's, you know, less economistic. It's much less economistic, opening it out to more wholeness. You know, all this complex multidimensionality, which includes mentality, so-called culture, all kinds of forces around it. Well, don't you want to do that? Isn't that good sociology? You know? You don't want to impoverish your theory by becoming overly economistic. Why would you want to do that? So that, again, that's not. And then in de-reification of the concept itself, it's globalization and it, we ask. Because people were kind of thinking like they referred to it as a reification. It, globalization, it does this, it does that, it would be this. It, what it are you talking about? Is there an it there at all? This is an abstraction. It's a concept. So de-reification, yes, and concretization. Well, let's talk about what we're actually referring to here. Yeah, with some concrete evidence, empirical. So, okay, so then we start to ask a load of questions. I'm getting now to point 9, you know, where we're almost there. Now I'm just going to rattle them off, okay, for discussion. But I think that when you're in this project, I mean, I've said how controversial and complex and nuanced this concept globalization can be and should be in its understanding and the way it's deployed, if it's going to be deployed, right? So there are a load of questions to ask. Is there one globalization, or are there many globalizations? You know, how many? You know, how do you designate what a globalization is? A globalization amongst many types, and potentiality. Is globalization a condition, you know, or is it? It's a set of processes, not a single process. A set of processes, globalizing processes, concept, or as in some of our group work, world historical processes. How many of them could we identify in this Lund book, World System History and Approach and Plans of Long-Term Change, which co-edited with Denmark, Friedman, and Podolsky after that Lund conference? We had a long discussion. McNeil was there too. Well, let's just, for our own sake, let's try to identify a set of world historical processes that we think exist. You know, so you could think of like, you know, state formation, urbanization. I could, you know, names them. You can come up with some, I'm sure, right? Or ecological degradation through human intervention. Lots of them. You know, world historical processes, demographic increase, you know, linear secular trend, and so on. But I think those are to be invented, like not like we had a definitive list at the time or since. But that's it. So world historical processes. What are those? How do you study? So that's related to what we kind of debate we've gone through with the world system. One world system, going through, we want to map it. It's from its origin place, its epicenters, and then its history of expansion and expansion. By the way, there's a magisterial work by Philippe Bourgeard, comes out of the French School of Global History, so I've had some engagement with. And Philippe Bourgeard was a fellow kind of member of our group. He's produced an enormous 2-volume study with several millennia, going back to the 4th millennium BCE, of the whole history of the Afro-Eurasian world system. It's amazing. And it's been published in English, because it was originally French, by Cambridge University Press. I mean, the tomes, the volumes are like this. It's difficult to put them on your desk. They're just immense. But in that the volumes, he has maps using the structure of the world system, much as I discussed, and showing both the territorial and the maritime routes of exchange and the major metropoles and the commodities, all of that in these maps, 200 years interval series, going back millennia up to the a few centuries ago. It's amazing what that he did. He did it in his own manner, but he's the only person I know of that's ever done it. But there's something I recommend looking at. Philippe Roger, his magnum opus was Cambridge English. But he started out as a Indian Ocean historian, but he got interested in our group, framers and so on. He produces enormous stuff. And he retired not so long ago. So that's another questions amongst the questions. Many world systems. Which world systems? How many? Where? When? How? So on. What kind of history? What kind of patterns? Can you compare those patterns? I mean, Robert McCormick Adams, who's at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, and was an archaeologist and also director of the Smithsonian Institution. He was also engaged with us and knew us and so on. And one of his studies, early studies of the evolution of urban society. That one had a huge influence on me when I was doing that reading. Here's someone who very early thought, why don't I compare the long-term structural patterns in the Mesoamerican systems, ancient, with the Mesopotamian, even though they're separated in time by some millennia, but are they parallel processes? That's an interesting question. And I think he found many parallels. Yeah. So that kind of thing, we say, well, we can identify which world systems are the ones that are significant that we can study in depth, and then can we compare their patterns, in just that analytical way in which McCormick Adams had once done, kind of pioneered. I suppose only looking at one world system as an expert. So we're trying to kind of, again, contributions to global history, to understand this kind of thing. And then the other one is, what is globality? Remember the quote from the Global Animals paper. And what's that got to do with mentalities? Human consciousness and awareness and understanding, a new sense of saying, well, the world has become fluid. And all those little categories of separations and others have broken down, and they're not really making sense anymore. So we've got to make the leap. It's kind of a cosmopolitan leap, if you want to call it that. And some philosophers of the ancient world called it that. We still use the term in different ways. But so how do you define what a globality is? By what criteria and so on? And then a historical globality and historical globalities, which is a concept I'm going to kind of end on in a sense. So that said, nearly there. So is globality a necessary condition of a globalization? Is systematicity of some kind, also implying structure, reproduction of structure, a condition of globalization? So also like this term, which I like in contemporary discourse in academia, world making. That seems a fruitful sort of concept to explore, which is paired with something like historical globality and world making, world bounded in a particular way, particular time, a particular context. It's not global in this kind of territorial, planetary sense, right? Global takes on a different meaning here, like a world. Okay, so that begs the question: Does a globalization have a structure? It's not merely a process. But like world system, perhaps globalization does have a structure. Or it does. What is it? And I mentioned some things we mentioned at the initial critique of the dominant theory of globalization in the 1980s, which we rejected, tried to overturn. But what kind of structures that generate the processes of globalization, or driven by, expanding from, instrumental to? Important question. Are there particular kinds of patterns, particular kinds of secular trends, or recurrent cycles, or rhythms, or crises that were generated by globalizing processes? Are they particular to globalization or not? Or they're more generic. Question. These are all questions. These are provoking questions. Is there an end to globalization, both in the kind of teleological sense and in the kind of limits sense? If globalization processes have limits, what are they? You know, I mean, right now we're talking about the ultimate limits to capital accumulation on a world scale being ecological as well as social, right? And ultimately political. But what limits? What you know? Where do globalizations end? Do they end? Are they just endless? Are they inevitable? Is that an interesting question? Why? Which instances do you point to that inevitable globalizations? So and of course the question always arises about linearity. I recently read, and I recommend The Dawn of Everything, some months ago, and then David Wingrove came over to Helsinki. He had a public forum packed to the rafters for the launch of the Finnish translation, I think 31st language of that book. And David was really wonderful. And we had a really lively discussion. I criticized him there in the public meeting for insufficient diachronic and especially synchronic analysis in the book, and then having cherry-picked vignettes to make the argument, which he was very gracious about. I like him very much, and I want to read more of his work. Not long may prosper. He's a good chap.
We have a very deep connection with David Wingrove here, because a lot of us come from UCL.
Okay, oh, brilliant.
And that's fine, the microphone can pick this
It's a
up.
good thing I said good things about him. But yeah.
This is why we're laughing.
Yeah, well, yes, and that's too bad, but sad, but of course couldn't be part of all this. I did know him and admired him greatly. Had some really interesting discussion with him many years ago about such things that I talk about in the book. But I want to end on this. This last thing is about the intensity or degree of globalizations. Is there a spectrum? Like some people want to measure a weak globalization, a moderate, a strong, a super, but on a spectrum, so it's just this one condition. I don't know, is it could be understood to have different degrees of intensity, how we measure it. That all raises the question: how do you measure it? How do you identify it? How do you measure it? So I want to end on this. So a kind of admonition to the group that the undertaking this very fruitful, interesting project that was certainly corresponding around this past globalization. Is that ever increasing engagement of archaeologists in dialogue with others and other disciplines. So, like globalization as an organizing concept, this idea of organizing concept is well known in the social sciences. I'm just recapitulating. Is that here you have you're not so fixed on a singular concept, but an ensemble of concepts, which can actually be quite large, but in which you posit that there's a central concept which are pivotal to the ensemble, right? To which all the others in a way kind of enhance meaning or understanding in a more holistic way, and are useful for that, right? That you can only understand globalization actually through deploying an ensemble of attendant complementary meaningful concepts that relate to it, give it more meaning, right? Okay, so we can do that. You can do a mind map of it. I've asked my students to do it year after year. And development as well. Put development in the center as the organizing concept, and we do the whole mind map. We can do that with globalization. Try it with your students. See what they come up with. Which would be changeable, group to group and context, country to country, and so on. But looking at it like that, and so like you'd have this whole ensemble in a kind of set of scholars, right, making their choices and say, well, okay, one, we need to have this discussion. We need to sort through this in terms of our circle of correspondence so we can have a common language. At least we have to know what we're discussing in a way that we all understand what we're saying, not just sloppily using undefined buzzwords. Right? So, again, some of the ones we've all been talking about: world system, globality, globalizing processes, world historical processes, historical globalities, world making, civilizations. You keep trying to come up with more that would enhance this. You see how it works together like that. And so that I regard that as a necessary step or process that scholars engaged with this should probably, I admonish, should do. that you think through and discuss it in a coherent way, coming up with some conclusions maybe of some sort that help them establish that common understanding and common language, scientific language. But that's so there's a warning that comes with this. In globalization, I would, on the other hand, I will just say I do think that globalization remains a central and probably a presently indispensable concept to understand connection, to understand this mutuality. Yes, I would say there's no globalization as a concept without searching for connections and the desire to search for connections and mutualities and mutual influences and shapes. So, okay, that's yeah, not contestable. But a warning, kind of cautionary tale, what I've been recounting, a cautionary tale. What really happens on the ground when you try and do this kind of transdisciplinary work. Is that, well, then don't conflate. It's kind of like an analytical error of the first degree. Don't conflate world system with globalization. Don't conflate any of them as if they're just identical. Don't do that, right? Resist that, avoid that, reject that, and then differentiate. And keep them differentiated, right, in their ensemble. Yes? And then debate about how you define them. How, what meaning you're giving to that conceptualization, and how you think it will be deployed. Would you do comparisons? Would you combine some of them to see how they work together? Not as the same, but together. Right? What utility comes from these kind of combinations? Well, I'm going to end on a combination that I personally favor. That's right. So, but again, it's also remembering purpose, remembering motivation. Why are we doing this? And I just go back to full circle to point one. Is that, well, I mean, the contributions to knowledge of globalization research for the present or past. I still hold that it's about how you construct a kind of cumulative human learning and understanding of our own common past, so that revisionist global history is still there as a great goal to be written, still to be written, because it's a massive undertaking, enormous, endless in its detail. What could be put into that is truly encyclopedic. It's huge. Okay, but there to be done, and some have tried it past. But that is also contributing to, as I started out, the human consciousness in the era in which we live, and to the existential threats to which we face. People are calling it pluri crisis. Multiple intersecting crises that may be amplifying one another, and time is running out. And the systems are failing. I'm just saying this, I think is real. Right? So I remember the purposes of knowledge construction. What? Why it's not just to understand the past and the past's own sake. Sorry, but I don't think so. Anyway, let's just make that admonition. So I'm really hoping that this project would be moving towards the crystallizing a circle of correspondence in the way that we did around globalization, to critique it a long time ago and re-theorize it and open it up and pluralize it and so on. And the same with world systems. So that this might be moving that way yet again, but you don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of old texts to read and go through some of what we did, even some decades ago. Well, I've got a set of collections here that go from 1991 to 2006. Core Periphery Relations in Pre-Capitalist Worlds, which was published in 91, edited by Chase Dunn and Hall, and it included a lot of the usual suspects from the World Historical Systems, almost everyone, including Andrew Sherritt, I think, so it's also one of the books. And this one, Globalization, like ending with, I mentioned the world system history, the social science of long-term change. And then this one I did with William Thompson, another member of the group, an international relations theorist. Globalization and global history, this is 2006. But there are others. I just named some of these. Because it's good to look through and see the kind of debates we had going back quite some time ago, but still relevant, I think, rather than reinventing conceptual views. Form this circle of correspondence. And I advocate the centrality of these two nuanced variations on the concept of globalization. Historical globalizations. So I would stop talking about globalization in the singular. Reifies it. It's a trap. Don't want to go there. Historical globalizations. Okay, what are they? How? Why? Who measures them? Who knows what they are? Who identifies them? Who studied them? How did they study them? What was the data? Etc. And historical globalities, because historical globalities is something compatible with many kinds of analyses of scales, even micro scales. When Chase Dunn did this famous study of the wind tube as a tiny world system in California. That's right. Well, okay, yes. That's a kind of historical globality, and that Robertson and Inglis were talking about that in the Roman imperial period. There was a very strong sense amongst the intellectuals of this kind of historical globality. It became natural to them to understand the world like this, because the world had changed so much, and they were recognizing the way the world was. Okay, so that's what I just said. So continue the dialogue, agree to disagree. Chart out your own position, make your own definitions, define your own measurements, find your own evidence, and deploy it within the context of this larger discussion and debate for making this new kind of knowledge. And so engage in fruitful dialogues, explore, conceptualize, and be analytically creative. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry, for the very, very thought-provoking talk. I could have listened to this for another hour. And I was just telling Daniel, we should change the title of our series to Rethinking Past Globalizations.
That's a problem.
Well, I mean, we still have to update our new flyers because we have some changes in our program because of the strike, and then we're going to put out new information over that. But that may be a good opportunity for us to change the title of the talk.
Right.
So why don't we take 2 quick questions and then we'll move on to having further conversation over reception. But then who would like to start the questions now?
Although it's only 2, so they're shy.
Oh, well, I mean, we can also just now move to the reception.
I could ask, so you were going to define capital in an ancient sense.
Are you sure that you asked this question?
I don't know, because I had another question, but unfortunately you need to answer that question to ask.
I probably won't answer it. Yeah.
No,
That's a question.
it wasn't the only person.
Most of the questions come first. Well, good. Get it over. Well, now you see, Isaac Ekholm and Jonathan Friedman wrote this piece in 1979. He published in 1982. I read it greatly, and then later Frank and us together. And that, as capital imperialism and exploitation in the ancient world. Right? And so again, it was like we were. This idea wasn't unique to us. That okay, wait a minute. Rather than the normal narrative that capital only comes very late in world history and only becomes dominant maybe a few centuries ago at most. Some people probably think only the last 2 centuries. Well, if you take it as an important form, so what is that form? Going back millennia, right? So it has a sort of set of conditions which again is like it's extremely difficult to go down. Charduri thought it was like a going down a garden path, wild goose chase, to be spending all your time trying to find the origins of something, including capital. Okay, well, maybe, but again, it's like it's contingent on, say, certain forms of property. Yeah. So, and then the control of the labor power intended and the revenues attendant to the right to control the own property, right? And then it is related to commodity production, commodification, and elaboration of exchange networks for those commodities with the aim of then accumulating a profit, right? So that's not so wild compared to what we think in modern terms of what capital is. It's a form of social power. It's a form of social ordering, organization, social relations, like Marx said. Yeah. But then it has these concrete manifestations and preconditions of other forms that come together to produce capital. Right? And like Mons Larsen, who worked with our group decades ago, was an Assyriologist. And one of the things he brought to our table and in publications, he said, well, I have all this evidence from Kanesh, from the Syrian merchant colonies, far out in Anatolia. So this is the capitalist enterprise. And they deploy joint capital, they have an extended market, they employ wage labor, it's commodity production to exchange on the market to realize a profit for capital. And it's in the second millennium BCE, but I've got the documents. So like if you've got the documents, if you say, if they don't fit the theory, there's either something wrong with the evidence or something wrong with the theory. Right? Yeah?
Yeah.
So that's what having the open mind about it means, that you follow the evidence where you can find it. But you don't find it unless you're searching and willing to see it or interpret it in a certain way. Because otherwise you close and you like blinker. No. It's not there, or it's not important. And I dismiss it. No, right? It's like that. So it is very difficult to ultimately define capital. But its its relationship with labor is the one where there's a transfer of value from the owners to the owners of capital, to like how they deploy the power, to they withdraw surplus product of society to themselves and concentrate it into their own power and ownership, and then that reproduces. Right? Yeah. Rather than dismissing this as a minor element in world history, we take the opposite. Did that help?
It did. No, that was pretty much exactly what I was hoping you would say. So,
That's not going to do it at the moment. But I'm working on a book right now with Hamid Hosseini called Redefining Capital and Value. So next time, maybe I'll be.
I'll say the other half of my question to the team.
Because there's capital is created, value is created by capital, and there's all the value in human existence and experience, which is outside the circuit of capital. That's a different, very radically different kinds of value. Yeah. But the idea that the only value that is any kind of truth is the value created by capital. No. Right?
I think, does anyone have? Okay.
I didn't have a question, but it could probably happen as a resumption as well.
No, go for it.
So you were talking about a lot of disciplines when you were talking about this coming together of people for understanding globalization, and I was really surprised throughout your talk you did not talk about psychology at all. And there's a lot of work happening in cross-cultural psychology where they're looking at processes which are universal or which allows change, and that's a really important part for me for understanding globalization. I'm also a cognitive scientist. So
Thanks. Yeah, I'm sure you're right, and it's just my ignorance. In fact, and then we didn't have a psychologist in the group, and when I was talking about the past and how we did this, it was a gap. Yeah, it would have been wonderful if we had such a person insisting, that we deal with it then.
because you talked about consciousness, but very, on the surface. So I think it's a very important part of what allows change and how orders will change, how the people.
Yes, right. I think you're right. Yeah. So again, maybe later you could find a way to send it to me. Really, that's what I should look at.
Yeah.
Please.
Okay, we have one more question from Max, and then we'll just move to reception.
Barry, thank you for a fantastic talk. My question's about system dynamics and agency and intentionality.
Good.
So if we were to think of system dynamics, emergent properties, things which are unintentional but are products of a massive collective intentionality, but which are unpredictable, versus instances where people are intentionally, agentatively trying to change the situation. And I was wondering how you understand the interrelationship of those two things. Now, to contextualize this, I've been sort of very influenced by Arturo Escobar, the design of the pluriverse work, etc., radical interdependence, autonomy, making worlds, all that kind of thing, right? And one of the things that I do struggle with in that is the way in which the emphasis on localized community autonomy and design, I think, is very, very powerful, but the presentation of the wider extractive neoliberal system as one which is, to some extent, singular, is a globalizing force which acts with some intentionality when it probably doesn't as an entire entity, I find somewhat problematic. And there's lots and lots of examples I think you could pick up on. The anthropologist James Ferguson, I think, has wonderful ones of great examples of where that intentionality of the neoliberal system does work. to oppress and to extract, and in others where it falls apart when it comes against localized forces and demonstrates its massive ineffectiveness, right? The Sutu is its classic study. Yeah. So how do you understand that interrelationship between, or how should we approach that conundrum almost between broad system dynamics and design intentionality agency?
Well, that's a brilliant question. One of the most interesting, difficult ones, right?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to put you probably, there's no easy answer to that question.
No, it's a lot of discussion.
Yeah.
I can only just sort of give an impression. But I think, yeah, again, it's like, so maybe it's that they're both, right? And I share the critique that you mentioned about the limitations of the pluriversality approach. And in fact, Hamid Hosseini and I are now, right now, next week, looking through the abstracts, we did a call for a special issue in Globalization. It's about beyond pluriversality, kind of critiques of pluriversality and where else you could go with our arguments, our understandings. Yeah. So I'm on to what you're indicating, on that side. Although I have highest regard for Arturo, this one, both personally and as a great scholar. Yeah. So a really central person in our field, and we know him well. He's a good friend of Helsinki. So in correspondence with him. So that also said, taking nothing away from Mr. Warren's contribution is great, but then we just want to move the debate forward, as you just said, because there's something missing. Some of my colleagues really take exception, as some have, right? And take the whole post-development idea, and even say it's privileging of particular kinds of class position intellectuals in the north, who can easily, or even Mignolo in the south, and say, well, some of you academics sitting in these universities, you're not part of the social movements, you're not part of the struggle, you're not out there on the front line, and you're talking all these ideas about throwing out modernity because it's Western, because it was imperialist, because it's part of colonialism. Well, no, we're not sure. But again, there's right. There's certain elements of so-called modernity that we think are very positive, and what the real problem is that they're absent. Right. Yeah. So I mean, dead right. You got real division in development studies. You got people like Hajin Chan. Ever since the Kicking Away the Ladder and all these works that he's done. He's Cambridge, right? That's the traditional approach in political economy of development. No, hold on. You want to come out of underdevelopment. You have to diversify and industrialize. You have to get out of commodity dependence. You have to go, post dependence. Primary commodity export, natural resource export dependence, and all that goes with it, and debt dependence. That's the central goal. You cannot whatever you do, you cannot abandon that goal. Yeah. Right? Because then you're condemning people to the legacies of colonialism, racism, slavery, and all the misery that goes with it, and so on, right? We just can't do that. I have colleagues that just say just that. Yeah. So now you're opening up a whole big box in my field, global development studies, and how we're debating this now. What are you saying? And it's a really central question, because not everyone is living in a small community. Whatever ideal aspects those communities may or may not have, when you study intensive, different, you don't want to romanticize. So, right, and then you say you also don't want to just isolate them out into a little microcosm with no reference to the synchronic, overarching whole structure of global capitalism. Is that a good move to do that? And then to advocate it as a way forward. It's a way forward for a small part of humanity. I'm just trying, just sort of.
The Zapatistas are not going to be the model for
in
the rest of the world. Yeah.
And so I think we're on the same wavelength. So we can talk about it some more. I don't have like a neat answer, which I do, but I would just say that I did some work with Ronan Palam back in the early 90s, international political economists, and we did a book called The Neo-Structuralist Agenda and International Relations. Because at that time I still considered myself an international relations student, early days. But what we said is that structures are fluid. Structures are not fixed, immutable. They have a history. They're historical. They have an origin, an apogee, a decline. Or structures change through agents. Of course, like with Marx, people make their own history, but not in the conditions of their own making. Or Giddens or structuration. There we go, right? But still, I hold by the formulation that structures are changed by agency. There is a default where you might think, you just fall back. This is happening right now with neo-realism, making a kind of a surge back and say, look at this Ukraine war. And look now, you see, we'll have a rivalry. War will break out. The great powers will go at it again to have a hegemonic succession. It's their old paradigm, right? And the system needs a hegemon. That's the old hegemonic stability theory. This is going back in IR theory a long time ago. Well, yeah, I mean, but you see what happens is that you go back to this default, very conservative and small c paradigm. So kind of like, Hobbesian. Your life is brutal and short and full of
People
bore.
start acting on those pieces because they lack the imagination to see beyond them.
Maybe so. You see, that's what they do in this new book. I mean, Thomas Forsberg is the director of the Legion for Advanced Studies in Helsinki, and my friend and colleague Heikki Patamaki is a professor of world politics. They've just come out with a book, which I was just at the launch the other day at the Collegium, which is like looking at the whole Ukrainian question, but doing counterfactuals. Well, hold on, wait a minute. Rather than seeing this thing as just an inevitable thing that was going to happen because Putin is an authoritarian and he's an expansionist and he's an opportunist, it's all, sort of mainstream narrative, which is very powerful and really dominant. So it's difficult to say anything else, not be called basically a traitor. So, supporter of Putin. No, I'm serious. Very, very bad. Even peace movement, and almost like a dare. Raise their head above the parapet and speak out of it. But they're saying, well, let's go back. So, let's go through, go back decades and let's go more comprehensively and see like so many factors working upon this and so many different kinds of trajectories that might have been pursuable. And then, which forces acted on what to choose the ones that were taken. And the ones that were taken have led us to this, right? So we have a much more complex understanding of how this came about. Right? Yeah. Okay. Good. If that's better than just reverting back to neoliberalism, I'd say neorealism. Yeah. Well, maybe that's enough there.
Yeah, that's fine. Sorry.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much.
Can I just say a quick word about the next? Oh, do you think we can